either have to stand here, or you gotta.
If I use my gym voice?
You have to
Oh.
just,
Really?
Oh, right here.
oh, you're not sitting.
No.
No. There?
Let's see what happens. Not sure.
You speak with such certainty.
I would say, if you stand at the front of that one, you should be good.
Yeah.
I guess you can always run to the office and listen to it and see if it's picking up audio.
I would stand where Kevin's sitting.
Right there. Okay.
Superintendent go to. You're live, we're streaming.
Okay. Okay, are we ready? Well, good evening, everyone. I think we're going to get started. My name is Kevin Godden. I'm the superintendent. I'm just going to say a few things before I turn it over to my colleague here, who's going to talk about first stage in our budget cycle. But I thought to start by warning you that we are live streaming, which means apparently I'm supposed to stand here, and now you're not on camera, by the way. Just the presentation will be on there for those who want to tune in. But I thought I would, since you're here and our crowd is small, we could do a quick little around the room introduction. What school you're from, if you could just share that with us, and then we could try to keep it cozy. And obviously, during the course of the presentation, we'll invite some questions. We'll be informal in that respect, because we want to try to interact with folks and answer questions. So maybe can we start with you?
Yeah, sure. Tanya Burke, and I'm from Claiborne Middle School.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Tanya.
Dustin with the Abbotsford News.
Hi, Dustin. Why don't we
Candace Work. I'm Vice Chair for DPAC and also on behalf of Sanderson Elementary.
Sherry Anderson, DPAC Chair, AMS, and IBC.
Freddie Latham, School Board Trustee.
Shelley Sefton, I'm manager in the finance department.
Darren Marr, purchasing manager for that.
Shirley Wilson, Trustee.
Parker Neufeld, trustee.
Preet Rai, trustee.
ATSS?
Member on the HSS PAC as well as Vice Chair at
Jean Ashton, Chair for
Okay.
Oh, Kayla Stuckart, communications manager for the Abbotsford School District.
Okay. And I think that's everyone. So why don't we jump in? I'm just going to walk us through a little bit through our agenda here. We've just done number one. I'll just take a few minutes and start with the budget planning process before I'll just turn it over to Ray to talk a little bit about our amended budget and some of our financial indicators and the whole process that we'll go through this year for budget development. So many of you will know that the school district operates on a cycle. In a number of cases, people think about school districts operating from September through July, but what a lot of people don't know is we receive indications about our funding from the ministry every March, and we have a requirement to pass our budget by the end of June, and our fiscal year, though, obviously starts in July the 1st, but that process actually never, ever stops, because we're either in the process of budget planning, preparation, or are in the approval cycle. What I think is a really important part of this is any budget presentation is not just about the money. We are actually in the child enterprise. And as I am fond of saying, our budget is just an expression of our educational aspirations. And our board has expressed those aspirations in the form of a strategic plan. And so some of you will have seen before those 4 pillars that you see there, having to do with a progressive workforce, engaging opportunities, optimizing our resources, and student success. It's what I like to call an all-in strategic plan, where the board has captured a plan that involves every single employee in the organization finding some way to contribute to student success. What you see there is that there is a significant amount of investment that this board has made in the strategic plan. While our budget is over $220 million, we can identify about $4 million of targeted spending as a consequence of some of the work that's being done as a part of the strategic plan. Many of you will know that this entire province is in the process of modernizing its educational programs in a way that would make students more prepared for the future, and Abbotsford is no different in that regard, and this is a big part of the work that we do to try to provide the best possible opportunity that we can for students. I'll break it down a little bit more just so you get a chance to see what that means. The progressive workforce section really just talks about the people in the organization. We have 2,500 employees. We are the largest employer in the city. And obviously we know it's a very teacher-centric. Teachers are the ones that spend the most time with kids. But part of the board's investment is in making sure that every one of our employees, be they support staff or bus drivers or custodians or clerical staff, is invested in student success. So you will see $200,000 additional spending put in that area. Engaging opportunities, we have goals in there about our technology plan, about parent engagement, and again, an additional $1.5 million spent last year. Optimized resources is about really the efficiencies that we find in the system to reduce our footprint, if you will, and to allocate more money to instruction. And obviously, the biggest part of it is the investment that goes on in our schools and in our classrooms. And as a part of last year's budget, there was an additional close to $1 million invested in that area. So it is with that I'm going to turn it over to my friend here, who's going to take us home the rest of the way.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. So I'm going to do a couple of things. First, I'm going to start off by walking through the current year budget and our amended budget, talk a little bit about the forecast of where we see our finances in the current year. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can expect for next year. And someplace in the middle of that, we'll talk about some financial indicators, things that we look to just to see if we're on track, see how we compare to other districts, see if our trends are going in the direction that we expect to see them go. So the board, I think it was at this last meeting, approved the amended budget for this current school year, and our fiscal year runs July 1st to June 30th. And so what you see is revenues of just over $217 million, expenses of $222 million, and a projected budget deficit of $5.2 million. Now that is from our consolidated operations, and we run in our financial statements with a number of self-sustaining funds, if you will. There's an operating fund where, just like it sounds, it is the place where we do all of our operations. So that's where we spend most of our time in these meetings talking about the budget, is making references to the operating fund. But also included in our budget, there's a capital fund where we have capital transactions. That's where assets are purchased and expensed. We also have special purpose funds. So things typically that the ministry has designated to us as to be only used for a single purpose. So in the current year, our operating fund deficit of that $5.2 million, 3.9 is in the operating fund, and about 1.3 million in the capital fund. So we're going to talk mostly, like I say, about the operating fund component. So of that $217 million in total consolidated revenue, just under 187 million is for the operating grant revenue. Most of that is made up in provincial operating grants, about 96%. And you can see that the next biggest piece is our international tuition revenues. But we're highly dependent on the province, and you know that, or you may know that there's a funding review going on right now. And it had been anticipated that it might roll out for the next school year, but I think it's on about a 1-year review process again while they continue to look at it. And it is of high importance to us. Small fluctuations in that funding model when it represents such a big part of the whole revenue, could be significant to us. So we're paying close attention to what happens with that funding review. On the expenditure side, just under $190 million. Most of that, the vast majority, is in the area of instruction, and you can see the other areas where what the accumulated surplus or deficit is. So we've always been in an accumulated surplus position, and we started the year with $8.8 million in accumulated surplus. We have to apply that deficit in the current year, which we project, and if you saw our amended budget, would project that our accumulated surplus would drop to just under $5 million to $4.9 million. However, we already know that that we can make an adjustment to that projected surplus because we include in our budgets, so all of you that are here from a PAC group know that we give schools budgets and we allow them to carry over the money that they don't spend in one school year to spend in the next school year, so they can save for a bigger expenditure, but we don't penalize them by taking away the money that is unspent in a particular year. So in the amended budget, we put back all of the school surpluses or carry forwards from last school year, put that back into their budgets, but we anticipate that they'll still have carryovers on June 30th of this current school year, and we think that amount will be about $1.5 million. So that would affect our total accumulated surplus to put it at a balance of about $6.4 million. Now I talk about accumulated surplus a lot. It's the indicator of our financial health. It's an important part for how we plan and how we feel confident in planning going forward. So you know that in some areas the board has put money aside from that accumulated surplus for specific things. One of them has been to run Strong Starts. We run one of our own Strong Starts, so they've set money aside for that. The board has set money aside for technology. They set money aside to help us transition through some pay equity issues with our education assistants. So there's a number of things that are in our accumulated surplus that are set aside as reserves and things that we target how we want to spend the money. And then there's some unrestricted amounts in that accumulated surplus to help us deal with things like our utility costs this year, as one example. In the last 4 months, our utility costs are about $150,000 more than we had anticipated, just because of the rates being charged for natural gas. So it's good that we've got some cushion to fall back on, and that cushion is accumulated surplus. What we typically would like to see is an unrestricted surplus of somewhere between 2 and 3% of our operating expenditures. So that's $3.5 to $5.5 million. So there's just a picture of our accumulated surplus over time. It's fluctuated a little bit. Up in 2010, it got up into the $12 million mark, and it's fluctuated a little bit up and down for the last number of years. But you can see that in 2017 and 18, it declined, and it's forecast again to drop in 2018-19. And I've included on this chart an updated forecast of where we expect that accumulated surplus to be. The line that goes across right under that $6 million mark is the target of the maximum of that unrestricted surplus that we should have. So we're starting to get into an area that is more uncomfortable for us with less ability to respond to emergent needs. So we're going to talk a little bit about some indicators, like how do we know where we sit? Are we spending money in the right areas? How do we stack up comparatively? So I'm just going to walk through these. I'm not going to talk about them in any great detail, but just to give you an idea of where we fit. So I've given, typically you're going to see an Abbotsford School District charted on one of these graphs. You're going to see a summary of all lower mainland districts, an average of what all districts in the lower mainland either receive in revenues or spend, and then a provincial average as well. So when you look at the revenue comparisons, you see that we're pretty much in line with other lower mainland districts. On the other revenue side, on the other side, we're kind of in line with those. One of the areas where we are a little bit lower than particularly other lower mainland districts is in the tuition revenue. So with international tuition fees. One of the reasons for that in our district relates a lot right at this point in time to our capacity enrollment situation in our schools. Most of our schools are exceeding or at capacity already, so we just simply don't have the space for increasing that international student population. Just a picture of how that revenue has changed in the last 5 years. The significant change of $28 million is in the provincial grants. Obviously, that's where we get funded for all of our operating costs, salary increases, cost of living increases, things like that. And we spend just under $1 million a day running our schools. It's a lot of money. Sometimes we don't stop to think about how much we contribute in the community, but every day $1 million is spent just to run schools in the school district. So on the expenditure side, we look at the same kind of comparisons. How do we spend? We have 4 main functional areas of spending in our budget. It's instruction, administration, operations and maintenance, which is all of our facilities, and transportation. And so we look in these areas and say, well, are we reasonable compared to others in this area? So typically we see in this case we're spending more on instruction, and this is all based on the 2017-18 financial statements of all these school districts. We're a little bit under in administration, we're a little bit under in operations and maintenance, and we're about on par with transportation. We're kind of a mixed district when it comes to transportation between an urban and a rural. There are some more of the districts to our west have very little in terms of transportation that is run by the school district. So then we look a little bit deeper into the comparisons, and we look at our main employee groups, our teachers, our principals, vice principals, our education assistants, support staff, and other professionals. That's typically the management people in the school district, and see how we compare there. And again, we see that we're within that reasonable area of comparison. So one of the areas that is kind of interesting is in supplies and services and utilities. We typically spend more than other districts in supplies and services. And we typically spend less on utilities than other school districts. If you follow the board and some of the things that happen, our director of facilities a couple of board meetings ago reported on his strategic update to the board, and reported on our utility management and our overall energy conservation practices. And what he reported there was that we're very efficient in our utility use. And so it's not surprising to any of the trustees here or to anybody in finance when we see that we are a fair amount lower in that area. So the difference between on the supply side now, what we spend on supplies and services, and if we were to only spend what that lower mainland group spent, we would spend $4.5 million less. If we were to lower our bar down to that lower mainland bar, that would represent about $4.5 million. So some of the efficiencies that we create in other areas of our budget allow us to have more money to spend in those areas. Typically those are for resources and things like that. I talked about this utilities one. We save about $700,000 a year. Our facilities department is relentless when it comes to managing our utility costs and the whole area of our environmental sustainability. just translate this supply number to a different one, it's about $100 a student more we spend on supplies than other Lower Mainland districts. So just the change in spending over the last 5 years. $33 million in instruction we've increased over the past 5 years. And just under $2 million in the last 5 years in the area of operation and maintenance. Not a big change really anyplace else. Transportation we've decreased, but we've had in our strategic plan the last year and the previous year some incentives to reduce our transportation costs. So we've seen us being able to reduce our transportation costs over that 5-year period. And one of the areas that our Director of Finance reported on was one of our strategic goals is to continue to ensure our resources are spent on instruction and to continue to target the instructional area for spending. And so this is that same period of time when we look and how are we doing in targeting the spending in instruction. And we think we're doing a pretty good job in that regard. The trend line is pointing the direction that we want it to be pointing. So last year I had a nice fancy loonie behind this, but this year we don't have that. So this is just a description of how we spend every dollar. So 59 cents of every dollar we spend on teacher salary and benefits. Then we get to see the other groups, principals at 7 cents, education assistants at 10. I'm not going to read all those, you can see them. And this will all be online for you as well on our website. So that's a picture of how we spend every dollar of that $200 million budget. Any questions on those? Comparisons? Anybody have any?
Just a quick question, how much has the province changed the formula for surpluses across districts? And because it used to be ours, and are they nibbling away at them, and how are they doing that?
Yes, in fact, I will touch on that, Trustee Neufeld, when we get to the budget pressures, because it's one of the issues we see with the province looking more closely at school district surpluses and things like that. Okay. So in November or December, the board approved the guiding principles for the budget, and really it's about supporting the strategic plan. It's about doing meetings like this where we build some understanding in our budget so that people can speak with some degree of knowledge about education and the spending that's related to education. We build a 3-year plan so that all the things we put in place are sustainable in a longer term. We have a fairly extensive technology plan that really wouldn't survive being built just 1 year at a time. So some of these things are bigger plans that span multiple years. So we do build that 3-year plan to make sure that our spending is sustainable over that period of time. And again, maintaining a reasonable surplus and reserves to respond to emergent needs and to help the board plan. Sometimes they implement things to test and see if it's an area they want to get into with a program or something. It's good to be able to pull on reserves for things like that as well. And then to maintain our strong fiscal management in the district so that we are in tune and informed with all the financial matters that occur. And one of the important parts of that is to look at some of those comparators and see how we're doing relative to other districts. So as we start planning for next year, and in every year, enrollment is our biggest factor. It determines about 98% of all of the money that comes into the district. A little over 98% of all the money that comes in is related to an enrollment of some sort. So it is a huge driver. It also drives our facilities, it drives our staff, so it is the biggest driver obviously of cost as well. So it really determines the number of teachers that we need, and with teachers making up almost 60 cents of every dollar we spend, this is a key component to that. So this year, the province announced that the education funding would go to $6.57 billion, up from $6.34 billion the previous year. It's still highly funded on a per student basis. And there are some other factors, obviously, that flow into that as well to distribute money to school districts. One of the components is at the end there's a cost-based funding model for the Classroom Enhancement Fund, and that is to deal with the return of the collective agreement language from 2002 that was came from the Supreme Court ruling a number of years ago. So there is some funding that goes to districts to say, here's your old collective agreement language. What are the resources you need to be compliant with that? And so it has been more of a cost-based model because we've had to simply submit our costs related to that shift back, and then those costs have been funded. So one of the issues in the funding review model is the wide discrepancy in collective agreement language from district to district. In Abbotsford, we're very similar to Langley. We virtually have the same enrollment. We are very close to the number of schools. We're very similar districts. We get $11 million in Classroom Enhancement Fund money, and they get about $20 million in Classroom Enhancement Fund money. So it just has to do with their collective agreement language and what class size language they had and what class composition language they had back in 2002 that had to be restated. So there's a number of those factors that make the whole funding model review that the province is doing very challenging for them. So once we get that money from the province in our budgets, we have a process where we have an allocation model to distribute those resources out to whether it's schools or departments. And the process really centers around our allocation model to schools, where about 72% of the money gets distributed. And then you can see the rest of the distribution to other places. So in education services, for example, that would be things like our learning support services department and our curriculum department. I think the rest are pretty self-explanatory, whether it's business services or facility services. So our school-based allocation model, and if you're on a PAC, this is of interest to you. But prior to 2017-18, we had a really flexible, decentralized funding model to our schools. We would distribute that 72% to schools. We had to live within class size language, so they would endeavor to do that. But schools had a lot of flexibility around determining the local needs at their school, so making sure that their school was responsive to their student population by staffing the school appropriately and being able to access other resources in the same way. Since 2017, I guess we started that, we've returned to the previous collective agreement from 2001, and that has resulted in us having to go back to a very centralized model because we've had to enforce not only the class size language, but class composition language, how many designated students or students with special needs can be permitted in a class. And so we've had to move back to a very rigid staffing model. The schools will still get their distribution of 72% of the resources, but they will have little flexibility in determining how that money gets spent. It's back to ratios and staffing ratios, for example, and so they've lost some flexibility in managing their budgets. So that is one of the biggest things that has affected schools, I think, in the last couple of years is the restriction of having some flexibility in their resources, whether it's what the staffing makeup is at the school or other resources and how they choose to spend them. The amount of money has increased to every school in the district substantially. So it's on one hand, we hear sometimes schools talk to us about they don't have the resources, and what they're really saying, I think, is they don't have the flexibility anymore because they actually have more resources, at the school than they've ever had. So talk a little bit about our budget pressures going forward. Our weakening surplus position is of concern. Trustee Neufeld asked about the ministry's reach into school districts' surpluses and what's going on in that regard. The ministry has looked, obviously they look at our financial statements every year. They see collectively a fair amount of resources tied up in school surpluses. Vancouver School Board probably has had the biggest surplus of any school district in the province and has had for many, many years, despite all the news articles about them not having any money. But the change that has been instituted has been that the ministry expects districts to contribute some amount of their surplus, some reasonable amount that they determine towards capital. So you know that we are in the process of or awaiting approval for a new school up on Eagle Mountain, and the ministry has requested that we contribute in and around over $2 million to that project. So taking that out of our surplus is also going to be something of concern when we see it getting into that weaker position to begin with. So that is one of the budget pressures that we have to deal with and figure out how we are going to make our contribution for that school to be built. The board has also made commitments, because they've done them over longer periods of time, of about $400,000 from that surplus going forward. And one of those is to run our Strong Start that we have there, and we've been running it for a number of years, and the surplus money's there to continue to run it. So there's some previous commitments that the board will have to deal with going forward as well when they have to reevaluate their entire surplus position. We also face recruitment challenges, whether it is in a specific program or just any program, and turnover of employees. We've seen in the last couple of years a real shift in this, and the immense workload in human resources, in our human resources department, to make sure we've got staff in all of our classrooms. So that's an ongoing challenge for us in the budget. Space is an ongoing. If you look at that enrollment and you see that enrollment going up, between 100 and 200 students a year, those are 3 or 4 classrooms a year requirement. Sometimes 4 classrooms. And if you, most of our schools are at or exceeding capacity. As a district, we're almost at 100% capacity already. So that is an ongoing challenge for us going forward. The funding uncertainty, again, sometimes going into a period of uncertain funding, I would be inclined to advise the board to put money into reserves so that we could cushion the impact of any funding change that would happen when it does happen. And so that is an issue we have to deal with going forward, and with that weakening surplus, are we going to be able to do that or not? And then just general cost increases. We've seen things, the most dramatic one is to see our natural gas costs spike the way they have this late fall and winter. And it's really been alarming to see some of the fluctuations that we've seen. I mean, we've instituted a 1 degree drop in our set points. A lot of people would suggest that some of our set points to begin with are cool. But we've lowered them again because just the increase in cost. We've had one day we had a 30 or 40 time increase in the total unit rate for natural gas. So when it goes up 30 or 40 times what it normally is, that's pretty significant. So, and like our facilities department, I think has done a really good job in monitoring that and reminding me every day when it changes. So any questions on any of that?
With regards to the the elementary school being built up on Eagle Mountain now, is there gonna be plans with all the construction on the east end to also incorporate a middle and a high school? Cause I know it's quite busy over there, like, all the schools are at capacity over there.
Our manager of capital planning works very close with the city on all areas of the city that are have potential development, any future development at all. And while we see the growth on the east side for sure, one of the areas of sort of an increasing concern, and I don't know if concern is the right word, but more of an increasing awareness for us is in the core area of the city and the growth that's occurring in the core. Because we're pretty landlocked in some of those spaces as well, and many of those schools are pretty full. So yes, we actually own some other property up on the east side of the district as well, but continue to work with the city and any discussions with developers around land where major developments might go in.
Cause I know even with like the amount of basement suites going into some of these newer divisions and the amount of kids that are going at that as well, like we're not talking 1 or 2 kids per household, we're talking 5, 6 per household.
Yeah, so when we have really sophisticated demographic software that we can estimate that, the city tells us there's going to be 200 single family homes built here and, condos and these apartments, and we typically can estimate the yield rate out of each of those units. But what's interesting is to that very phenomenon where it used to be, I think, 0.8 students out of a house. It's changing. So that is one of the issues we have to stay on top of is what's happening, who's living in these homes, how many students can we expect to see. So one of the things that we also can rely on is our population projections. So while we do the student enrollment projection, we also do general population projections by age groups. So we know how many we're dealing with in the age groups as well. So
Yeah, and the ministry doesn't necessarily plan ahead. They count kids that are there, then they build a school. So they don't build a school and hope they'll come. They actually find the kids in a certain area first, then they designate a school. So by the time they build it, it's full.
typically the ministry wants to see schools at capacity. Eagle Mountain will open very near capacity when we build it and open it. That's what they expect to see. When they make significant investments in schools, they expect to see the enrollment capacity is the driving factor in all those considerations. Every project we have with the ministry, that is one of the biggest factors. So that is for sure as time goes on, we try to stay ahead of that curve by having land available, and then the board annually approves a capital plan that takes into account all of those our enrollment projections. But what we've actually started to see in the last year and a half is a shift into this core area that is more alarming for us, because there's not 6 or 7 spare acres of land in the core area of the city for a school.
Could you just touch on the OCP then?
Pardon me?
The OCP, if you could speak about that? Just in terms of how that's impacting us.
Well, certainly the city's change in their official community plan to develop the more core urban areas has resulted in the densification of those areas. And so we're starting to see more, like I say, more buildings going up. So in our discussions with the city, they've had the same conversation with us about the new type of school we will have to start to think about building that will maybe go up to, because just the available land is at a premium. So it's going to be an interesting time going forward if the core does densify the way that plan lays out. It's going to be an interesting time for us for sure.
I just want to add to that a little bit, is that one of the things that we're faced with as well on the OCP is that we respond to it. We don't create it. It isn't something that it's council to school board's body. It's something that was a community consultation outside of the board, and so we respond, and that puts us in a different circumstance.
We always find a way to make it work, though.
Yeah, we have to.
So as we move forward, our next biggest task is to set our enrollments for next fall, and to be as accurate as we can with those so that we see not a lot of disruption at schools looking for staff or having too much staff in the fall. So it's important for us to really have a firm grasp on those projected enrollments. And then we'll start doing staffing and complying with collective agreement language, building our whole staff component of support staff for next year, allocate our money out based on our strategic plan, so there'll be some updates going forward. You'll see at our next budget meeting that it'll focus a lot more on the strategy and the initiatives that are going forward to support the strategic plan. So there's a lot of work around aligning all of the things that we do to that strategy. We'll come up with some plans to address our budget pressures, whether it's the weakening surplus position or not. But that's one of the things that we'll have to do is have some plan for how we address all of those budget pressures. And there may be more that we find in the next couple of months as well. And then the board will review any of the risks that are there related to implementing its strategic plan or the budget, and what mitigation strategies might we put in place to mitigate those risks. And then in June, the board will approve the final budget. So.
Question about, you mentioned a spike in the utility bills. How about the employer, the health tax? Is that having any impact on the budget?
I would say it's not had any impact on the budget because we budgeted for the change.
Like, I don't know, is that pretty substantial? Like, I don't know, try to fit that in? Like,
the one piece of that was the province was funding the shift for us for the employer health tax that we had to pay. So we have to wait till that funding announcement comes out in March to see what that exactly looks like. We think there might be a little bit of a gap, but we're not 100% certain yet. So.
You mentioned the government's change in their funding model and probably about a year out from what that looks like. Do you have any indications at this point in time as a government talked about kind of a directionality of that? Are you just kind of preparing for the worst because you're keeping everything safe, or is there an indication that it is going to be reduced?
Well, they've released the funding model report that has got a number of I think substantive changes to it. I think that when you look at how the system currently is structured with such vastly different collective agreements that require districts to comply with very different language district to district, that not having some component of a cost-based model, I think, is very difficult. So while I think that some of the changes that they proposed would have less of an impact on us, I think that we're going to be left with somewhat of a cost-based model until they can come to terms with how to deal with the discrepancy between districts. And maybe there's part of this model and then continue with the current model we have with the Classroom Enhancement Fund. So the $11 million we get is sort of buffer us from the current spending to the here's what you have to do to get to the collective agreement language. So unless there's some component of cost base.
There's 60 school districts ranging.
Over the microphone.
There are 60 school districts ranging all the way from Surrey with 75,000 to, say, Haida Gwaii with 400. And so they have to develop a formula to address those extremities and all in between. And the challenge will be, because they have made the declaration, that the amount of money will remain the same. The pie is the same. We're just going to cut it differently. So we don't know how big our slice is going to be. though they've identified some of the key principles that will drive this, right? One of the concerns, of course, has to do things like heating, for instance. I mean, there are districts in the north that have a completely different experience heating than we will, and the funding formula has to be sensitive to that. And so they're mindful of those differences and are trying to be equitable. And so we're just waiting.
So the report that came out, is that as a result of our current government, or was that something that was being put into place or evaluated with the previous government?
It was, I think it started as soon as that shift to when we had to implement that old collective agreement language, because they had to come up with about $500 million in order to implement that language across the province. And so they came up with what they call the Classroom Enhancement Fund. That was a lengthy submission process for every school district. And that's how they distributed the money. I think they realized then that the current model needed to be changed. There had been discussion for many years. Typically, if you were a district that had declining enrollment, and if you couldn't respond to the decline of enrollment fast enough, you didn't like the funding model, because it wasn't designed necessarily to support enrollment decline. It's not designed necessarily to support fast enrollment growth either. So it's very difficult. I don't know that. I mean, that's one of the modeling things that you have to do with these models. What if I experience 8 years of enrollment decline of 5% a year? What's going to happen to my funding? So there's some things like that that have to be worked out in any funding model that they do. I just don't know that there's some perfect model. If you feel like you're not getting enough, you want a new model so that you'll get hopefully more. If you're like us, we've had steady enrollment and slow, steady enrollment growth for 10 or 15 years. The funding model has not been our enemy.
So, I don't know, when you're kind of crafting a budget for this year, when you've got the funding model review, you've got BCTF contract negotiations going on, how do you actually do that? How do you craft a budget with that much uncertainty?
Oh, with care.
Well, I mean, first of all, we would expect that negotiations of the collective agreement with teachers will fall within the mandate that the province has set for all public sector workers. So funded, and that will be funded within the mandate. What happens outside of that mandate that may affect funding, that's the area where there's potential concern. So we don't know exactly what that is. But when the board starts to contemplate what are the risks we have going forward with this budget, should we spend this money or should we not do it when we consider all the risks that potentially exist, then that's, you have to kind of weigh those. And, if they're really uncertain or we don't know, we generally will expect that costs that province negotiates with the unionized groups at a provincial level will be funded.
And would that mean more funding as well? Because you said that we get less funding than Langley because of the collective agreement, so would that change as well?
Yeah, well, as long as we get funded for the positions that we have, that's really what we want. So if we have 1,100 teachers, we would expect that the pay increase or whatever benefit costs related to those number of employees would be funded for us.
And Langley would expect the same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So are seismic upgrades funded by the government as well?
Seismic upgrades are funded by the province, and they fall into the same rules as any other capital project around what the funding component looks like. Typically in seismic, what the province looks for is the lowest cost option, and then after that, they want a cost share from the school district. If there's additional costs, there's a number of other components that play into capital. I said earlier that capacity utilization is one of the factors that's looked at. So, and it's looked at with every project. What is your enrollment like? What is the area's population looking like. So that's a component of all capital.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned.
Oh,
Stay
yeah.
tuned
The
on that,
cycle
yeah.
goes on, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Well, our finance department does all the work to get all of this information ready, so they're the ones that in the next 2 months will be working very hard to draft budget estimates and to do all the costing related to all of the different programs and services that we have. So when everybody's on spring break, finance department will be working on the budget. Somehow the province finds a way to distribute the operating grant information the day before spring break starts.
Really?
So,
Nice.
So you didn't book a vacation.
so any other questions? If you have questions or comments, you can go to our website, submit them to us there. We will do our best to incorporate any ideas and suggestions into future presentations. If you have great ideas, they might make them their way all the way to a budget proposal.
This is all gonna be online, you said?
Yes. Wow. Easy questions.
Well, it's starting to snow outside, so we figured.
Oh, is it? All right. In that case, right? Yeah, if there's any other questions, feel free to ask. But with that, I will say a thank you. A thank you to Ray and to Linda for all their work in starting the process and keeping the cycle going. And happy good evening to all of you.